Hi everyone, can you hear me? Excellent, all your heads went up, that's a good start. I can see there's a few people just trickling in at the back at the moment, which is great. And obviously feel free to come and sit at the front, there's lots of empty seats here as well. Thank you all for joining us today for our session on assessing the impact and value of learning, something that I know was picked up in the session previously for anyone that was sitting in the audience for that session. I'm Helen Marshall, I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Thrive, host of Diary of a CLO podcast, if any of you have listened to that, I can see some nodding heads, which is great, and also founder of Women in Community. And I'm joined by Terry Bird.
Yep, I'm Terry Bird. I lead up learning and development and talent management for Vonage. If you're not sure about what Vonage does that, obviously. Vonage is a unified communications company. All of you will use Vonage every day. Many of you will be completely unaware. So if you get a text that says your Amazon parcel's been delivered, you get a call that says your Uber driver's just around the corner, it's usually Vonage that's supporting that service. So there's a bit of an insight. Ask me some more about Vonage afterwards if you need to know more about us.
And at Vonage and Thrive have been working very closely for a couple of years now on, we're obviously the learning platform provider for Vonage, and we've seen some huge success alongside you, and we've got a lot of stories to share which we won't have time to dig into today, but lots of interesting stuff that we're going to dig into in today's session in terms of that impact and value piece. So we've done the hellos, we can skip past that slide. Before we begin, what we'd like to do as we go through this session is really make it quite a hands-up interactive session. So get used to sitting with the person next to you and turning around and having a little chat. Terry and I are both very passionate about driving impact in learning, and it's something that L&D have gained a little bit of a reputation for not focusing on in as much detail as they should be, but actually there's a real want and a will there to want to have to prove that whatever you're rolling out, what initiatives you're working on, actually do have value and drive impact for your business. Ultimately, if you're not doing that, what's the point, essentially? And we're both passionate about that as individuals, but also within the work that we do for our respective companies as well. So if you can turn to the person next to you for a minute, maybe two, to talk about some of the challenges that you're currently facing with assessing impact in your organizations. And at the end, we'll just do a quick shout out for a couple of those challenges that you might be facing. Okay, I'm sorry that was a very short discussion, because I'm sure you'll be able to go into a lot of detail in the conversations that you're having with the people next to you. Can someone put a hand up or shout out one of the challenges that you're having? Investment in capability training. Okay. Anyone else?
I guess sort of measuring the impact of the training programs we deliver.
Yep. Measuring the impact broadly across your business. Yep. L&D impact. Yeah. Do you want? Yeah. You can use the mic. Yeah.
Should I start over? So L&D so rarely works in isolation. How to isolate L&D impact from cultural impact or process impact, or those things?
Great, yeah. So a bit of cross-communication and boundaries and stakeholder management obviously going to be involved in that as well. So yeah, really interesting point. Thank you. We're going to dig into some of those things, talking obviously about impact more broadly as we go through today's session. But we're going to focus in on 4 key questions. So they are, what should we measure? Do we understand what it is that we should be measuring around any initiatives that we're rolling out in our organizations? How do we measure, which can often be a barrier for people when they're thinking about what data is available within their organization or their businesses? And then how do we actually communicate that across the stakeholders that are involved or across the business for the people within your colleagues or who work for you? And who should we involve and when? So again, coming back to that stakeholder management piece. So it's not only about understanding what it is you should measure and how you should measure it, but then how you're actually talking about that and showcasing the success. Again, proving that L&D do have a space within a business. It's obviously something that is obviously quite scrutinized a lot of the time. So Terry, I know that you've got three key buckets here that are really good.
Yeah, we're going to talk about 3 distinct buckets of skills today. We're all doing the first one, I'm sure. You know, the vanity metrics, what we would call historical, the number of bums in seats, how many people took a piece of learning, how many people attended a live session. Very useful for compliance type training, where we just need to tick the box and make sure everybody did it. But it doesn't tell us a lot about actual impact. And when we look at these other 2 buckets, we're really talking about direct and indirect impacts. Direct being how have we actually moved skills and competencies, affected behavioral change, performance outcomes, things like time to onboarding, time to productivity, staff retention. But indirect is just as important, and we'll talk much more about this as well. Things like employee engagement, health and well-being, mental health, EMPS. I'm sure everybody does an annual employment engagement survey these days. These are equally important outcomes of learning and development initiatives and programs that we're going to talk about.
And I think it's really important that they are equal. So a lot of people might be looking at those kind of vanity metrics, but actually thinking about those direct and indirect skills as well and looking at those measurement areas is really important.
So, show of hands. Bit of audience participation. How many of you are measuring these vanity metrics today? How many people took a piece of learning? Yep, we would expect that. We're just going to flick through and show a few more show of hands here when the range and the clicker works. Let's do that one. Skills growth. Who has a skills taxonomy in place that they're measuring against? Behavioral changes. That's going to look very different by role. Oh, there we go. Helping to improve actual performance. Who's measuring that? So as we go down these layers of complexity, you see the number of hands going up diminishes very quickly. I think there's a last one here.
It's not working. Sorry, Terry.
Who's considering the impacts on engagement and health and wellness and well-being of your employees as part of your L&D? Very, very important. We're going to talk a lot more about that and how it relates directly back to the first set of metrics as well. A last show of hands, who's working cross-functionally across the business to build these viewpoints? Good, okay. So there's a range of representation on those. None of these questions at 100% in terms of the hands going up.
What was interesting there was that there were less hands raised for measuring against improved performance than there were for impacts on engagement and well-being. So really great that we're focusing on those areas, but also the performance impact is obviously a key area of any initiative that's being run as well. So
yep.
Really interesting to see.
That is working. Good. So, we're going to talk about the currency of learning and development. And currency is clearly something, like any currency, the value goes up and down every day depending on the environment around us. The value can diminish over time. I'm sure we've all got some Greek drachma at the back of a drawer somewhere in the house that used to be valuable to us, but they aren't anymore. And we think about skills in that same way when we think about the currency of L&D as well. Skills are perpetually changing. The value of the skills that we need changes over time. We've heard this morning in the first session about how generative AI is increasing the rate of pace of change of the value of those skills. So we're going to focus in very much on that angle first and foremost. And we talked about the interplay of direct and indirect skills. We can measure the direct ones, and we'll talk about that, and we can measure the indirect ones, and we'll talk about that, but they cannot coexist independently. They have a very close relationship. The skills and the ability for us to do our job have a direct impact on our sense of well-being and our engagement as a team member. If we feel empowered and enabled and equipped to do our job, we're going to be much more motivated, engaged, turning up to work feeling a much better sense of being ourselves and bringing ourselves to work. If the opposite is true and we don't feel equipped, we don't feel empowered and skilled to do our job, that's going to have a direct impact on our engagement, but also our mental health. So we're really talking about that interplay of these two things as well. And we'll dive into that more deeply.
I think it's really important to think about that broad lens of what's going on across your organization, who you have to communicate with, what you're doing, what you're rolling out, what impact you're going to have, what impact you're going to have on the well-being of your people. But actually that can become quite a scary thing to think about all of those things at once. So something we speak about a lot at Thrive is breaking things down into things that are a little bit more tangible, and you don't necessarily need to think about the bigger picture of ROI as one big thing, but how do you feed into that in incremental steps along the way? So yes, it's important to consider that with a broad lens, but then start to break it down. And it was really great again to hear in the previous session around that experimental attitude, which is something we'll talk about again in a minute, but it's that kind of thinking about smaller steps along the way that is really significant here. And feeding into that, how are you creating the right culture within your organization? So I know we mentioned vanity metrics at the beginning of this, and they're often put to one side as not really having an impact on an organization. But I always say that if you have good vanity metrics, good engagement statistics, you're starting to show that your culture is headed in the right direction. Because going from no engagement to engagement is a significant step in itself, and you're starting the ball rolling on that culture of learning within your organization. So as long as you're looking longer term into the future and looking at things that you want to measure and the impact that you're going to have on performance, on well-being, like we've just said, on skills, that's where the important focus should be. But actually you've got to bring everyone along on that journey with you. But when we talk about learning engagement, well, what does that really mean, and what are we actually measuring? And I think one thing that, Terry, I know you speak about quite a lot, is the amount of hours that people are spending voluntarily learning, and obviously being able to log that on a platform, but actually understanding that people are curious and they want to go and learn and they want to better themselves and they want to push themselves and perform better. So if you have a way of understanding who is taking the initiative to learn new things, that's brilliant, and that's a sign of a positive engagement level that indicates a healthy level of learning culture within your organization. Now, are those learners as well giving us useful feedback? So can we actually action the feedback that people are giving us, and can we do that in an agile way? Agility is something that comes up time and again when we're talking to forward-thinking L&D teams. It's being able to respond quickly to whatever information is given to you, and being able to pivot if you need to as well. And does that feedback indicate any trends throughout the year? Are you seeing that there are ebbs and flows in the way that people interact with learning across your business? And if there are, can you lean into that? That's a data point in itself. Are you understanding the behaviors of your people? Which is key, because I think L&D, and Terry will speak about this in a moment, really need to hone in on those listening skills and understanding what people are saying. And again, the feedback that they're giving you is really important. And then breaking that down by role or function. So are you able to look across your business and understand that that team over there is doing a great job? They're all sharing knowledge. They're all really proactive in seeking the right information or performance support. But over here, we're really struggling even to get people to log on to a system or utilize the tech within a business. So maybe you can then look at that area of the business and think, what can we do? What lessons can we share? What lessons can be learned as well? Step too far over. And I think Terry's going to speak a little bit now around that employee listening piece.
Yeah, we talked about feedback there and how incredibly important it is. I mean, quick show of hands, who has implemented something like a skills council, a learning guild that has representation from across your business so they can feed directly into your learning strategy? Learning MPS, captured at the point of learning. These feedback mechanisms are incredibly important, and they're really useful information. And of course, like any other information, the value of that information diminishes very quickly over time. So as Helen said, the ability to be agile and react to that feedback very quickly is very important in terms of keeping that learning engagement culture up, because we can lose learners very quickly if they feel that we're not listening to them. So we're going to focus in a little bit on the skills as the currency and how we're measuring the skills going into everybody's personal piggy bank of skills. So we're going to talk about that now. So if you Google, how do I measure the ROI of learning? Most of the results will come up with something like this, the Kirkpatrick model. Who's come across the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation before? Yep. We've all seen it, we've all read it, we all understand it. It's built on 4 tiers. Along came somebody called Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips isn't in the room, is he, today? Just checking, okay. I'm not going to be critical, but I am going to reference Jack Phillips' work. So Jack Phillips built upon the Kirkpatrick model and built a 10-step model of evaluation of ROI in learning. Because the Kirkpatrick model itself, although it measures impact using before and after differentiation around learning, doesn't tangibly measure ROI. So Jack Phillips came along and said, okay, I'm going to add new layers to this, and what we're going to do is take point-in-time snapshots of before and after. We're also going to look at other processes that can be impacting performance, discount the impact of those processes, and then we're going to bring in a cost-benefit analysis to calculate what the ROI of that piece of learning was. That's great, and it's very theoretical. But we can disappear very quickly into these theoretical models and lose all tangible sight of what that actually means in our business. So I'm going to offer to you a simpler way of thinking about this, and that's this circular model. Because the Kirkpatrick model, the Jack Phillips model, they all operate as if you were able to freeze the business and take a snapshot before and a snapshot afterwards. Whose businesses look exactly the same 1 month after they introduced a piece of learning and allows you to take that measurement as if nothing else changed? And that's entirely the point. We operate in dynamic environments. Our businesses change daily. Our learners change daily. The industry around us, the marketplace, everything is moving. Nothing allows us to take that specific clean snapshot and everything looks the same. So it's perpetual. So what this does is really break down the ideas of the Kirkpatrick model and the Jack Phillips model and others and say, let's just take this in a circular motion and think about the building blocks that allow us to take this. What are our learners learning? What skills are they growing? Because if we have a defined skills taxonomy, in Vonage we have a 4-tier skills taxonomy: entry, foundation, advanced, and thought leadership. Everybody can have their own version of what a skills taxonomy looks like and maps learning against it, but it gives us a tangible way of measuring progression of skills mapped to competencies by role, by function, by skill type. The feedback that we're gathering of that learning in a near real time, and how does that impact on actual behaviors on a day-to-day basis of our learners, and ultimately leading to outcomes, performance. So if you think about in a sales world, for example, We want our sellers to be able to understand a solution that they're selling. We teach them about it through learning. We can measure and validate those skills through testing, stand and deliver, those types of things, getting their feedback, monitoring behaviors. So for a CRM system like Salesforce, we can actually see what conversations are they having, what opportunities are they creating, how are they progressing pipeline, and ultimately, are they actually closing business? Are they winning competitive deals? Are they achieving their quota? And when we break it down into those building blocks and connect them logically, and then learn from them perpetually, we can be fine-tuning as we go. So it's an adaptation of the Kirkpatrick model, but just an everyday agile form of putting those building blocks together. And when we step back as learning designers, and we think about that logical flow around that circle, when we design a piece of learning every day, we'd like to think, by show of hands, that all of us start with a learning objective. As learning designers, it's one of the first things we pick up and we learn, and we always start with, what is the end point? We don't just design a piece of learning and throw it out there. We think, why are we creating that piece of learning? What is the behavior we want to drive? So ultimately, we're starting with some kind of business goal where we want to encourage the right actions to achieve it. And through doing that, we introduce a piece of learning to drive those behaviors, and we validate that those behaviors are happening. It's no different to classical learning design, but when we break it down to its simplest form and make sure that we have measurable steps at each of those building blocks, then we can create that picture. And it's boiling it down to each individual simplest use case and those building blocks.
I think that's one of the things people often struggle with, again, coming back to that idea of the broad lens, is there's a lot of complexity or supposed complexity around doing these things, when actually it is the basics, the fundamentals of even just learning design itself, working backwards, like Kathy Moore's action mapping, thinking what is that goal that you're working towards, and how do you ultimately make sure that you're gaining that kind of level of learning at the end of it. So it's just thinking simply and not overcomplicating it, which I think we can all be guilty of sometimes. So if you look at that broad lens of aligning to business goals, which again is something that we often hear from a lot of the customers we work with that they struggle to do, and that's always a first point of conversation, is thinking about what are those broader objectives, how are you feeding into them in a really tangible way. And if you have a good understanding of what's going on in your business, as any L&D team should, then you're able to think about the initiatives that you're rolling out, feeding directly into the impact that it's having on those goals. So if you're not already doing that, that's a great place to start, and it's something to think about. But what does that mean from a practical example? Well, we've got some examples here on screen, things like, well, every business is going to be focused on revenue targets. That's ultimately, if you're not making money, then that's a bit of an issue. So how are sales and marketing performing? How are you tracking that? Where's that data kept? And can you get your hands on it? Are the things that you're looking at feeding into those revenue targets as they should be? And how do you trace it back from there? We've got things like health and safety, and that comes to operational or compliance training. So you're thinking there around, well, actually, you might see an increase in reports of incidents rather than a decrease because people are understanding what they should be doing, or you actually see a reduction in incidents happening, which is brilliant. So practical kind of data that you can pull out of individual health and safety training there. We've got things like customer NPS, which Terry spoke about previously, and that links to your product quality. What are customers saying about you? Again, is there feedback within there that is actionable, or do you have to shift and pivot based on that information? And then, of course, the focus on corporate social responsibility is important for many organizations and becomes a strategic pillar for a lot of businesses. So how are the initiatives you're involved in feeding into those broader targets for your business? So again, like coming back to this idea of how are you aligning to those broader business goals? And you can start to break it down in really simple ways. So again, just to reiterate, if you're looking at that broad lens, then how do you break it down into those simple steps? And then if we're thinking about establishing benchmark metrics, this is something Terry and I spent quite a lot of time talking about in the preparation for this session. because benchmarking can be internal as well as external. So you want to know that you're performing well against your competitors. If you have the right information out there to understand what's going on, that's brilliant. But then internally, again, coming back to the point about departments and roles, are you able to show that this part of the business is doing really well over here? And what does that mean for the rest of the business? Is there a way to benchmark expectations of performance across different departments within your businesses? And then, of course, we've got things like CSAT and ENPS, which Terry has already touched on. But I know, Terry, that you had a great example to share around I think was it retention in industry or learning tiers? I can't remember which one.
Learning tiers. I mean, there's some famous examples. Microsoft, when they pivoted their go-to-market model in about 2015, 2016, I think it was, they broke down all the individual roles. So they used to turn up to the customer with 10 different roles that would represent different parts of the software portfolio. And they said, right, no, every single client representative that goes in front of a client needs to have a foundational level of understanding across the entire portfolio and be able to represent it. And so they mandated 400 hours of learning per employee in that year and measured it to make sure that everybody could get to that common level of foundation. Salesforce did something very similar with Slack when they acquired Slack, and they had all the Slack employees do that same level of common understanding for the entire portfolio as well.
But I think interesting too, those two examples, Microsoft were felt quite strategic in what they wanted people to be doing and why they wanted them to be filling in those 400 hours, whereas Salesforce mandated that people just had to generally learn in order to upskill without any broader direction around it. So then it becomes questionable as to why they were doing that in the first place. So as long as you're tying it back to those strategic business objectives, obviously, if anyone's from Slack in the audience and can share as to what objectives they were feeding into, I'm all ears. But from the media, it sounded like there wasn't really anything tangible other than Slack and Salesforce wanted people to be using their internal upskilling platform, which is also available to the general public, coincidentally, as well. But I think, again, tying it back to that broader idea of how are you feeding into your skills objectives. So we spoke a little bit earlier around experimentation. I think it's really important that anyone working in L&D starts to or continues to adopt an experimental mindset, because we're often very guilty of doing a training needs analysis or gaining information from across our business partners within a business and then taking steps to rolling out those initiatives or creating something, and then, as Terry said earlier, a week or a month later thinking, well, nothing's really changed. But if we adopt an experimental mindset and think, well, we think this is going to happen if we do this, does it actually happen? Can you test that hypothesis? And it becomes really important to do that if you're going to be really agile, because if you're not responding to what people are telling you, you're not rolling things out quickly, or thinking, actually, I'm not really sure if this is going to work. We're just rolling stuff out, thinking that's definitely going to have the impact we need, and then off you go, and we never really look at it again. That's an issue. You know, it is people's skills, people's lives, people's personal development that we should be thinking, well, actually, we want to do the best for people here. So what can we experiment with within the realms and the capabilities of the resources that are available to us? We work with a lot of customers at Thrive who adopt this mindset. Obviously, Vonage and Terry are one of those people, and I'm sure, Terry, you might want to share an example. But I know one of the customers we speak about quite a lot is Ann Summers, who adopt this experimental mindset to initiatives that they're rolling out. Part of what they do is A/B testing to make sure that actually they are having an impact in the ways that they think they should be. So it's difficult when you work in, when you're revenue focused and you want to be creating as many sales as possible, as some Ann Summers do. They don't want to create a learning experience that would have a detrimental effect on any part of their business. So they create a foundational level that they think is going to have the impact. They've tested that, it has had an impact. But how can they enhance that? Well, we think that if we add XYZ onto this training program, it will have a better outcome for our people at the end of the day. They tested that. They found that, yes, sales did increase by someone following this enhanced learning experience, and yes, sales increased by the less enhanced one. But they're testing it all the time, and if it doesn't work, they change those outcomes and the objectives and think about what that experiment might look like at another time. So if you can start to do that and think, well, let's just think a bit more experimentally, then you'll be setting yourself up really well for adapting and being agile. So I spoke at the beginning again around ROI, and it seems like the holy grail of what L&D teams should be feeding into. And yes, it's really important to be able to show that whatever you're investing in, whether that's training or people's development or products within your business, you need to be able to show that ROI. But you also need to, like I said, break it down into more tangible steps that build up to that bigger picture and understand what metrics what success looks like, what success metrics you're measuring as well. We've heard the cost of inaction spoken about quite a lot, and that's really useful to think about if you've not already started thinking about that. If you didn't take any action, what would be the result? And often, arguably, if you didn't do anything, you'd think people would just continue doing the same things they have been doing, and maybe if your intervention was rolled out, you might not even have the positive impact that you want anyway, which is why that experimental mindset is so important as well. But you can also reverse engineer this concept of ROI to think, well, if we have adopted that experimental mindset, we have had a positive impact, we know that this experiment has worked and is great, then, well, we've been doing this for 6 months, a year previously. How much has that cost the business? So if we roll something out now and we know it's having a change and it's impacting people, how much money would we have saved the business? So it's just looking back in that way as well at the data that's available to you.
And when we build up these models, the more we layer them up, the more data we have, the more learning we can take from it, the more we can feed into predictive analytics models. And if any of us who's working with your BI and analytics teams within your organization, so many of the BI tools that are out there today, Tableau, Power BI, and many more, have predictive capabilities now. Predictive analytics isn't magic or witchcraft. It's built upon simple data models and learning more and more from that data all the time. So the more we build these building blocks and layer up the data and learn from it, the more we can actually start to predict with more and more confidence, if we take this learning action, this is the outcome we can expect. And the more we can build towards this, obviously, the more effective we're going to be, because we're bringing into play all of those things we've talked about the simple building blocks of getting from the start to the business goals, taking that experimental mindset, comparing different paths that we can take, and learning what is the optimal outcome. So predictive analytics is where we're all headed to, but we can get there if we just start with the basics and layer up as we've been talking about. We're going to pivot slightly in terms of stakeholders and who cares in our business and why it's so important to have all of our stakeholders aligned with us on this vision. So examples of stakeholders will be, of course, senior leaders, people who hold L&D budget decisions and back what we're doing. But obviously there are stakeholders across the business. Functional leaders, our partners that we need to partner with, our learners are just as important stakeholders in this picture. So, if you flip forward, thanks, Helen. Convincing stakeholders is the right strategy is very important. So a couple of questions here. Show of hands. First one. I'll flick. How many times have you come up with what you thought was a great idea and a great measurement only to be faced with a blocker or even more frequently apathy? People just don't understand it. This next one's a good one. How many people present a learning strategy or talking about business goals with other people in the organization and everybody suddenly is an expert in learning and they know exactly what we need to do? Helen's talked about this one in a recent podcast a lot as well. We come across it all the time. So, articulating what we're trying to do is very important. When you come across that second bunch of folks, here's a slide you can use for free. I love to use this slide. Pop this one in. and that will get some good conversation going. We've talked a lot about... Is it changing? So when we talk about stakeholders, this checklist is important. And our measurement, what is the ability to report? Are we engaging the right data and platforms? A learning management system in its own will not be able to measure any of the bigger picture we're talking about. You need HR information. You need functional platforms like CRM systems, etc. Are your relevant functional partners with you? And are they also educated and aligned to what you're trying to do and bought in? Do you have the senior stakeholder backing? Are you articulating your vision clearly and verbalizing that amongst all those stakeholders? And are you doing it over and over and over again? Because you probably need to articulate this 4, 5, 6 times before it becomes really soaked into the environment and the stakeholders that you're working with. Okay. Clicker's gone, so I'll go here.
I think one thing that is worth thinking about as well as L&D teams is actually thinking like a product designer. So what you're creating for your people is essentially a product that people are going to use and people are going to buy into within your business. So one thing that is worth thinking about is radical product thinking to help with that broader alignment on vision and what you actually want to get to and what you actually want to achieve. Communication is half the battle. I saw a crazy statistic earlier that someone shared about 84% of people believe that things aren't working within their business due to communication breakdowns solely. Can't remember where I saw it, but I know that I read it and I thought that is a huge amount of people not communicating properly. So if we can utilize any type of strategy to help people understand where you want to get to and how you want to get there, that's important. So radical product thinking is created by someone called Radhika Dutt. Everything is free online and you can download templates to help you do this and to help you visualize and create this vision. But actually it helps you to verbalize where you currently are and where you want to get to, and then crucially how you're going to do that as well. So today when I'm doing this and we actually want to be doing this, they have to do this, which isn't great and it's unacceptable because of X, Y, Z. We envision a world where this is resolved and people don't have to do that anymore, and we're bringing this about through. It doesn't work in every single circumstance, but it's useful to create that vision statement of these are the problems, this is unacceptable, this is what we're going to do about it, and this is where we're going to get to. And that's just a really useful template to think about at this stage. There you go.
One last important set of stakeholders to call out. Managers. Who are the key stakeholders in the business who set the culture and are either the amplifiers or the blockers of everything you're trying to do? People managers, first-line managers. They set the tone for their team, they lead by example, and if they're bought into what you're doing, the chances are their teams are going to be bought into what you're doing. So we implemented a very specific focus on all of our managers in the business at Vonage last year. I'm pointing at my colleagues over here because we built it together. But they're very, very important. Don't leave your managers behind. And last, we've talked about every persona across the business except you, us, ourselves. We are equally important.
And I think it's really important for L&D to invest time in their own upskilling. These are some of the areas that we see as really important now. They have been important for a long time, but even more so now with the influx of new technology. How are you embracing creative thinking, storytelling? How are you looking at your data analytics skills? We saw a slide in the previous session about this again, and I think it's really important to think about those human skills outside of the technical ones as well, which was something that we didn't hear much spoken about previously, but it is really important to think about how you're investing in your own time alongside this. And I think it's looking at that broader vision for, again, where you want to get to and how you're going to get there. It's a bit of a reflection. I'm conscious we've probably got about 30 seconds left, so we'll do this really quickly. But ultimately, don't try and boil the ocean. Think about that bigger picture, sure, but actually break it down and think about what is actionable right now. Keep it simple. That's something we've spoken about throughout this presentation. Don't try and do too many things at once. And engage the right partners in the business. We can't stress this enough, that as long as you bring people along on the journey, and as long as you're building the right relationships, people will buy into that vision a lot more easily if they understand what it means to them. And align with stakeholders. So who are your stakeholders firstly, and how do you identify them, and how do you, again, bring them along on the journey with you? It's cut out of me on the last second. Experiment, obviously, the key point there is how can you do that, and how can you start to think experimentally within your business. If you're not already doing that, try something. Just try something. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you start to kind of get the ball rolling. And then also focus on yourself as well.
So in closing, one of the lessons here is there is no textbook for this. Every business looks different. We're all on a different stage of the journey, but hopefully we trust that some of these building blocks and perspectives that we've shared have given you some thoughts that you can go back and progress and look at with your teams. Helen and I will be here to further the discussion and continue on with any questions you have afterwards, so please feel free to come chat with us. Otherwise, all that's left to say is thank you.
Thank you.